Whatever you want.
All right, folks, welcome to the Reading with the Bereans Christmas Spectacular.
Ho ho ho!
We have our Christmas hats on, and we're ready to go. We can't really see what yours says, but I know.
Oh, I got a Red Sox Christmas hat on.
Wow, fancy.
Yeah.
Fancy. Mine only was 99 cents. My daughter calls it the Dr. Seuss or Cat in the Hat Christmas hat.
Perfect.
So we're here to talk a little bit about the Christmas story, and we're hoping some folks will join us along the way here, maybe live, and jump in with some questions. If not, if you're watching later, you can kind of catch in on some of the discussion. Judd, the Christmas story is one of those things that really sparks our imaginations in interesting ways. Like we want to know, we want the video roll, we want to know all the details.
We're not necessarily given all the details.
The Gospels give us some, enough to spark our imaginations and to really show what they want to show, which maybe we'll get there today, but not as much as we would like. Right?
Yeah. It's one of those interesting things because it's a story that everybody knows, right? We've all heard the story, but where have we heard the story from? Is it from reading the Bible, or is it from tradition, which takes on any number of facets?
Right.
And I think, quite honestly, one of the biggest of those is Christmas carols. We sing these songs, and we all know we three kings, and so we sing that, and we have this idea. Well, of course there were three kings, but where does that come from? Does it come from the song? When we look at the scripture, if we turn to Matthew's account of the birth narrative, we see that when these magi show up, they give three gifts. But that doesn't necessarily mean there's only three guys traveling across the desert,
I think my kind of guess or impression is that the songs, though, are based on older artwork, probably.
Sure.
That also goes back further, and there was some, late enough to not have a really sense of accuracy, but still early enough in Christian history, additional writings, relatively fanciful, that have really come to shape, I think, the way that we think about these things. And then, when people say you're in Europe and you're doing artwork of what this would have looked like, well, you think in terms of what do things around you look like?
Right.
What are our houses like? What are our stables look like? Where do we keep our animals? And these kind of things. And it all kind of develops into this tradition.
Sure.
But here's the interesting thing, Judd, and I brought this up in my sermon yesterday. I think this might be a snapshot of an issue of how we read the Bible. We think that we just open up the Bible and we read it, and we just see what's there, and that's all we care about. And we don't read through a lens or a tradition. And I think that's probably nonsense for the most part. Right. I think most of us have this picture in our mind, in this particular case with Christmas, and then we open up the scripture and we try to plug it into what we already think about how the story works.
Exactly. We all bring something to the text every time we read it. That's not an intrinsically bad thing. Sometimes what we bring to the text is actually a good thing. Sometimes what we bring is, I've read this a lot and I've studied a lot about it, and here's what I know that informs it. But we're also bringing, like you said, this is the world around me. This is the way I picture things in my mind. And I've never been a first century Palestinian, so I don't know exactly what their world looked like.
Right. Which is where archaeology and people that have lived in that area still today, where it's more in that culture than ours is, although it's removed, and people that study the language can give us, some helps, and we'll talk about probably a couple words here along the way. But I think one of the kind of core questions to ask is, if we're gonna say something or believe something, is, does the Bible actually say that, or are we inferring that? Because a lot of times there's possibilities it could mean that.
Sure.
Like we'll talk about in just a second here. There could have been three magi or wise men, or every put of it. That could absolutely be correct.
Right.
But the text doesn't say that.
Yeah.
And so what does that mean? I think as we communicate, it means we can suggest possibilities, but to tell a direct point and say, this is how it was, when the Bible doesn't tell us that, isn't really good ground to stand on.
Right. And it's fascinating to think about, Matthew did whatever research he did to get the narrative, to understand here's what happened, here's the important details, and then put down what we have in the text. If we could travel back in time and meet with Matthew as he's writing the gospel narratives, and we could say to Matthew, how many magi were there? How many guys were there traveling to see Jesus? Possibly what he would say to us is, it never occurred to me to ask that question. Because that's not the point of the story. When I was interviewing people and talking to Mary and saying, hey, what went on here? I wasn't so much interested in how many guys are hanging out. I was more interested in Jesus. I wanted to tell the story of Jesus. So very oftentimes we ask questions of the text. This is a prime example. I think the creation narratives are a prime example. We ask questions of the text that the text is not interested in. It's just not the point of the story.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, because probably in a lot of cases, and again, I don't have any idea whether Matthew knew more detail about the story or not. There may just be this is what he knows and this is what he's recording. But in a lot of cases, I think they knew a lot more than what they record. A piece of papyrus is only so big, and the biggest you can make it, which is one practical factor. But there's a point. These are not written just to tell every bit of nice detail that they possibly could. It's written to make various points about what happened and about who Jesus is.
Right.
And I think there's a danger if we redirect ourselves too much. Like, it's okay to explore these things, but let's not miss the main point. Like you said about beginning of Genesis, we can go off on all these things that may be interesting and even worthwhile discussions at times, but let's be careful that we don't miss the main point of the particular thing. Yep. So feel free, Kendra just dropped in a comment here. Feel free, if you're with us, to leave a question or a comment over here on the side, and we'll interact with that as they kind of come up. Kendra said, maybe my question is one of those. If you have a specific question, Kendra, type it in, and we'll kind of deal with it along the way here and provide
And Dan and I are always very happy to answer questions by saying, we don't know, because the Bible doesn't tell us. And that's, very oftentimes that's what we find is it's fascinating to think about. It's fun to think about. Right. But at the end of the day, were there 3 wise men? Were there more? Who knows? We weren't there. We can talk about the fact that certainly we can say with almost certainty that 3 men would not have gotten on their camels and all by their lonesomes traveled across the desert the way it's always depicted in the movies. We do know from history that these would have been dangerous routes. It would have taken months for these guys to do it. And you don't travel by yourself through the desert. You go in a caravan. Right. We still see that in the world today. So even if there's only 3 guys who are trying to make their way to Jesus, they're going to wait until 20, 30, 40, 50 other people are saying, oh, we're headed in the same direction. And great, let's caravan together. There's safety in numbers. Right. That's never depicted in the Christmas movies. But historically, we can, and culturally, we can say, no, that's how you travel across the desert. Right. For sure. Yeah, very interesting point. Let's recommend, if we care to, along the way here as well, some resources. One that you mentioned the other day to me in conversation is Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes by Kenneth Bailey. This is often referred to in other writings about these subject matters as well. Too. This book is not about the Christmas story primarily, but interestingly, it opens with that discussion. And so I assume some other good information as well too. So put that on your reading list. Yep. Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes. Another one that, Judd, I don't think you probably have, but is really excellent. It's the Lexham Geographic Commentary
on the Gospels. There's actually one on Acts to Revelation. They're actually in the process of making them through the whole Bible. But it provides commentary based on place, what we know about place. And there's actually three or so excellent chapters by biblical scholars. Interestingly, a lot of these are New Testament scholars that live in the land or have in Palestine, Israel. So it gives them interesting context. But there's chapters on, that relate to these things. And as we talked about the Magi, one of the interesting questions that we kind of wonder about is where they came from. And there's kind of, a discussion about that you can get into to the nth degree of, was it Persia, like where Babylon would have been, or was it Arabia? This here's a map. I should have probably uploaded this, but there's a map of depending on which one you're compelled by, where they came from. But what's interesting about it, as you look at this, is that whichever direction they came from, they come in from the east, right? So they come in east to west. Of course, the West Bank today is part of Palestine. So, but anyway, I would encourage people to pick up that. It's I think it's $30, but it's a nice hardcover book there. So, all right, here we come. Questions coming in. Kendra says, was it likely that the Magi sought the one who would have been born king of the Jews to buy social and political favor? Could they have thought this was a way for their societies to build relationship? Or do you think that they were genuinely worshiping the one true God? The way humbly bowed down to worship the king makes me think it was more the latter. However, it seems odd to me that they would travel so far to worship Jesus when they themselves probably didn't prescribe to Jewish beliefs. Yeah. What a fascinating
what was the motivation for the wise men? I'm going to read just the first few verses of Matthew 2. That's where we get whatever information we have about the Magi's motivation. That's where it's found. So Matthew 2, we read, in the time of King Herod, and I'll pause here just as long as we're talking Christmas. King Herod, one of the wonderful things is the ancients kept pretty good records. Ancient kings were very proud of themselves and they wanted history to remember them. And so they kept pretty good records. So we're able to say with pretty good certainty that King Herod, the one that was alive when Jesus was born, dies in 4 BC. So that when we're talking about Jesus' birth, hate to burst your bubble, it didn't take place in the year 0. But we're looking 6 BC, 5 BC, that kind of thing. Had to have been before 4 BC because after that, the historical timeline falls apart. So that's your fun fact of the day. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. And I'm reading from the NRSV, so they say wise men. From the east came to Jerusalem, asking, where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage. So they identify Jesus as the King of the Jews, and they want to pay him homage. Is that worship? Is that respect? Is that recognition of divinity? Is it kingship? Those are the types of questions that come into play. And this probably falls into the category of saying, well, we're not entirely sure. But I think one thing that is very significant, and this goes back again to why is Matthew writing this? Matthew begins his gospel, chapter 1, verse 1. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, and he takes Jesus back to Abraham, right? Son of David, son of Abraham. And in Genesis chapter 12, when God first appears to Abraham, one of the things that God promises Abraham is that through him, and he's thinking through his descendants, namely Jesus, through the descendants of Abraham, the nations of the world, all the peoples of the world are going to be blessed, which means that whatever happens through Abraham's descendant, again, Jesus, it's not just going to be for the Jews. This is going to be for more than just Israel. So we have Abraham kind of in the background here as Matthew's setting the stage for this story about this guy named Jesus. And almost immediately, Jesus is, and I say almost immediately, whenever it happened, we don't know when the wise men show up, but Jesus is born. And the first people that sort of get to interact with him in Matthew's narrative are not Jews. They're from the nations. They're from the outer peripheries. They're from the east, wherever that is, right? So again, rather than saying, what do the wise men understand? What do they think they're getting themselves into? And we can certainly speculate about that and talk about it and guess about it. But Matthew's point is, hey, look, what God said to Abraham, it's happening. Yeah. It's already starting, and I think that's where we need to focus with these.
And it's really interesting, Judd, because Matthew's gospel is the one that really kind of highlights the first to the Jew and then to the Greek kind of thing. But yet, as you mentioned, kind of baked right in here at the beginning is the idea that it's going to be much, much wider, and both in the genealogy and in this particular thing of, and I think that is a big part of it, is the, the recognition of who, of who Jesus is, in some sense. Again, we don't know. We could ask the Mary, did you know question of the Magi. Magi, did you know?
Right. Right.
For them, what did King of the Jews mean? It's probably safe to say it didn't mean the Son of God in human flesh and the ruler of the world. Maybe, right? But it says King of the Jews. So I think that's maybe to the front of Kendra's question, maybe, which is not one I've generally heard before. But are they trying to say, hey, if this is going to be the King of the Jews, let's
right.
With him. Hey, we were there for you, King of the Jews, before anybody else.
Exactly.
We're first in line. We pressed our buzzer and turned around before anybody else. So put us in there. I don't get the impression that that's the case. And again, we don't know.
And then they have a dream. And of course, dreams are a big part of the Christmas story. Mary has a dream. Joseph has a dream. There's these angelic visitations that are taking place. What's the Magi's understanding of their dream? Is this an angel of the Lord God appearing to them and saying, hey, don't go back to Herod? Probably not. Again, it's guesswork. Who knows? But God is working through whatever they're going to receive and believe, to the extent that they say, nah, we're not going to go tell Herod what we just saw.
Yeah. It's really fascinating to think about and wonder about, God, how is God at work in this? How is God at work in these people that, as we say, are not Jewish people, probably, right? Are not for them, most likely, although, every time we see, like in the Old Testament story, a foreign king sort of acknowledging God, we like to imagine a total conversion, where in this case, these Magi are now, they say there are no other gods. These stars actually don't mean anything. It's all about Jesus.
Right.
I think that's a stretch.
Yeah.
But for them to get here, I think in one sense shows God at work, even in drawing people to himself that aren't necessarily have full understanding, aren't necessarily all in,
you know. Right.
How these guys, got there, the dream, the star, there's a lot of discussion about who are these guys, wise men, Magi, are they kings? Are they whoever? What is it that they do? Are they astrologers in some sense? And a lot of scholars will say that seems to be the case, not necessarily in the sense of like we have horoscopes and, hey, you're going to have a good day or a bad day. Right. But a lot of people in the ancient world felt like the stars and the planets in the sky meant things. And that's what we would mean by using the word astrologer in an ancient, in an ancient sense. Yep. But I think it's safe to say this story, it bears more questions than it gives us answers.
Right. Right.
One of the things in the background, Judd, and I've not spent a lot of time in this, but with having just done some study recently, it popped up often in commentary and such, is a turn back to Isaiah chapter 60, which gets us into an interesting discussion in general about about the prophets and how it connects to different aspects of the Jesus story, but some have mentioned clues here in Isaiah 60. And let me just kind of pop in with a couple verses that have been interesting to folks. In Isaiah 60, verse 3, nations will come to your light and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Verse 6, herds of camels will cover your land. Camels were not probably normal there in the everyday life of them. Young camels from Midian and all from Sheba will come bearing, this is interesting, bearing gold and incense.
I've heard that before somewhere.
And proclaiming the praise of the Lord. So is this, I mean, that one in particular, right? And so what's imagined here is back to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Again, the idea of Solomon being such a wise and important person that all those in the nations around want to kind of come and pay their respects to him. And of course, you have the Davidic promises of the King, the Messiah, and that's through Solomon's line and those kind of things. But again, for someone like Matthew, is this Isaiah 60 in the background where he would perhaps see this as a piece of fulfillment, or at least a connection to this? I think it's possible or even likely.
Sure. And not Matthew only. Isaiah mentions coming to the light. Well, how does John start his gospel, right? The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Right? Does John have some Isaiah ideas in his mind as he's writing and describing the origins of the word as he talks about Jesus? Right. So all of the gospel, there's so many more Old Testament allusions than we think about or pick up on. And whether it's they're saying, oh, I'm quoting this verse, or it's just, I've read this verse so many times, the words are sort of in my mind. So when I'm writing, I'm using the same words that I've heard before. And the more we read scripture, the more we see that everywhere.
Yeah. I think we need to probably another time have a good conversation, and we have a potential interview coming up that would be a good chance to do that. But to talk more about kind of the prophets and the prophecy and how it relates to Jesus, because I think it's a little bit more nuanced than sometimes we want to kind of say, boom, here's the prediction, boom, here's how it happened. Right. And I think there's a little bit more to it than that. But there's like this imagination that people, readers of scripture, these Jewish people coming into the time of Jesus, they had all these scriptures and prophecies and hopes and dreams and expectations swirling around in their minds, more than just verse, but just this whole thing. And so it connects in so many ways, and it's really overwhelming in a great way.
Yeah.
I think, because I'm just like, wow, like as much as I start to think I know the Bible, and then I'm like,
right,
I don't know a thing. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. I think one of the issues that we have as preachers is there are too many related scriptures to tie in to any given sermon. Whatever passage we're preaching on, it becomes, I can only pull on so many of these strings.
Yeah. That's why I've just kind of decided that. I've said, I'm going to, Lord willing, I'm going to be a preacher for the rest of my life. And so I know I'm going to come across all these texts again and again. So I'm just going to have to pick a couple things this time and do those. And
right.
like talking about sometimes words and historical background pieces and possibilities and Old Testament. Sometimes you just got to pick one or two and run with it, because, you can't do it all.
Right.
Okay. Magi, one other interesting thing is the question of, how did they even know to interpret, there's the dreams, there's the stars. How do they even know to interpret this? People that like the Babylon, Persia location for these Magi / wise men, whatever, like to point out, I think it's really fascinating, the idea that during the exile, that substantial Jewish community there, having brought, their scripture and their understanding and things, could have well left that knowledge in the community.
Wow. I haven't thought about that before.
Even after they returned, and some probably didn't return, but having that presence there for that amount of time, and folks like these guys that would have been students of just say world religion, if you will, and all of these things would have probably been fascinated by the Jewish tradition and stories. So some of these hopes and expectations that a lot of the prophets were writing right during the exilic period, sure. Could have well left in their imagination this expectation of this king. And so they maybe had that. It's speculative, right?
Sure, sure.
But historically, it's they're there. If you go with the Arabia, which is more of that Isaiah 60 possibility, and as well, my understanding, which is limited, of kind of the source of some of these, the frankincense and the myrrh kind of things would probably be associated more there. Okay. But it went everywhere. So if you were wealthy, you could get it,
right?
No matter what. But that's kind of one of the open discussions where they came from, different things to say for and against, for each option. Scripture, again, is less concerned about the specificity of that. I think more concerned, right? What's the point? People are coming from afar. Somehow God is working in their lives, and they're coming to, to worship or to pay homage to Jesus.
Yep. Yep.
So, all right, let's see what Janice has to say. This is my mother-in-law, Judd, by the way.
All right.
Both of our mothers are here. This is my mother-in-law. She says, to me, the most important point of the Magi was the provision, the gifts that they brought that took care of the family when they had to flee to Egypt and and live there until they could come back to Nazareth. We do not want to know how long that was. So. Okay, interesting. This is one of those things that kind of, I think, in a way, makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, is not really the point that Matthew seems to want to make.
Sure.
Right. This is one of the things, Judd. These gifts that bring us endless fascination. And maybe a lot of speculation at times. A lot of people will want to very specifically relate them to aspects of Jesus's death.
Sure.
With burial spices and those kind of things. What do you make of that? Do you find that significant or more speculative? Or
I think that piece of it is a stretch, right? So
as far as the tied to Jesus' death,
right. We see the women in Mark 16 and elsewhere preparing spices to anoint the body of Jesus. And so here at the beginning of the gospel, Jesus is being given spices. Were these somehow, I wouldn't say the same spices, but the idea of, is this being prefigured? Spices are used to anoint a body, but I don't think there's any.
It's not a strong.
The wise men aren't saying, "Hey, here's what's going to happen."
Yeah.
Right. I will add to that last comment that was made. Very possibly, this gold and these spices did provide for the Holy Family in Egypt. And we don't know how long they're in Egypt when they go to Egypt. We do know from Luke's gospel that when Jesus is presented at the temple, there would be a rite of purification that Mary would undergo after childbirth, that the child itself would undergo. This was just normal standard practice. Luke tells us, and I think this is just so powerful. The offering that Mary and Joseph present is 2 turtle doves. And we know, according to the Old Testament law, I don't have the verse in front of me. I could look it up in Deuteronomy. Yeah. That the sacrifice that was required was a larger animal. But the provision is made, if you can't afford to bring a lamb, you can bring 2 turtle doves. And this speaks to Mary and Jesus' poverty, of course, something that will be picked up throughout the gospel narratives of Jesus' own life. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. So that 40 days into Jesus' life, it's not as though Mary and Joseph have extra gold and myrrh and frankincense lying around to say, oh, we can, give the biggest sacrifice. So that at least suggests that the Magi, whenever they show up, and here's another one of those bubble bursting, that they're not there probably on day one. Here's the baby. Oh, look, there's a knock on the door. The wise men are here. They're showing up sometime later. And again, the gospel writer's priority is not to give us that timeline precisely. But if these gifts are providing for them in Egypt, they're not providing for them performing the rituals at the temple. So that's another interesting thing.
Whether in or getting there, I think Jan's point is actually, again, where it's not the point that Matthew wants to make, but given the context and the strong indications that we have that you just mentioned, that Mary and Joseph are not well-to-do. They don't have a big nest egg. They don't have a 401k and an IRA and things to kind of tap into early. This trip, it's never mind being there, where surely Joseph would have had to work. I mean, you don't get to stay there for whatever the time it was necessarily. I mean, I guess maybe if it was that, we don't know again how much gold that they're given, right? It doesn't say. It's treasure chest or a little coin, or we don't know.
Sure.
But even this book does a good job of tracing the different possible routes, and it would have probably been 45 days, give or take, depending on the route, to get from where they were in Bethlehem to possibilities in Egypt. Right. So you're talking about a month and a half of travel expenses,
right,
without being able to work as well. Yeah. So interesting question.
And again, so we're picturing this in our mind, that doesn't mean Mary and Joseph and Jesus all by their lonesome crossing a desert. That's not how it's done. Think caravan again. As your
and they would have probably joined an existing caravan, right? Because there wasn't necessarily one that they were saying, all right, guys, let's all go to Egypt together, the whole town, but
no, there were major trade routes throughout the ancient world. Think about the 7 churches of Revelation that John writes to, and the trajectory. If you look at the map of these 7 churches, right, there's a very clear route of, this is how he would have delivered those letters, right? There were major trade routes, and Israel is sort of right in the center of these major trade routes running from Italy to Persia and down to Egypt and these kinds of things. So there would have been a route that, hey, if you're going to Egypt, this is the way to go.
And within the land itself, the topography kind of defined. Now, when you get into the desert, it's a little flatter. But as far as going from Nazareth to Bethlehem, the topography of the land pretty much defines the routes. You don't just choose to, hey, I'll go over 3 mountains instead of going between them. You kind of were made sense the ways to go. So there weren't a lot of options at that particular time. So really interesting stuff. One of the things, Judd, that is kind of more of a theological thing, and then maybe if you guys watching along have any more questions about the Magi and Matthew, throw those in now before we turn over to Luke in a couple of minutes here. But one of the things that's really kind of interesting, I think, to think about, and I guess I want to challenge people a little bit on, is the idea that when we talk about the birth of the Messiah, the birth of Jesus, the thing that when I say we, I guess I mean mostly evangelicals or the Christians that I'm familiar with, the primary thing we want to say was that he was born to die. And I think that this ties in with our oftentimes talk about the gifts of the Magi being related to his death. Much like we want to jump in the Old Testament from Genesis 1, 2, and 3 to Matthew, we tend to want to jump in the gospel stories from Jesus' birth to the passion events. What do you think about that kind of comment is kind of the thing, if you were to think about it? Obviously, Jesus came knowing that his, in God's plan, that his death is an essential part of the plan all the way along, et cetera.
Yeah.
But what do you think about that as kind of a primary statement about, he came to die, he was born to die, as being the kind of the Christmas thing to say?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to throw the question back to you in a moment, because off the top of my head, I'm not thinking, oh no, that's problematic. I think
it's not wrong, for sure.
Yeah. So one of the things that jumps to my mind as I think about that is the fact that Mark, for example, starts his gospel. This is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Well, his beginning is 30 years later than Luke's beginning and Matthew's beginning. He picks right up with grown Jesus beginning his earthly ministry. Certainly, all 4 of the Gospels, if you look at where the time is being spent, the majority of the time is in the last week of Jesus' earthly life. It's leading up to the cross. There's a geographic trajectory as well as a theological one. So to say Jesus was born to die, yes, there are elements of his teaching and ministry that we don't want to jump over, right? Jesus didn't show up on the scene and die the next week. He spends several years doing very important things. But as far as a primary thrust, my thought at this point is I'm good with that Jesus was born to die. But let me throw that back at you and kind of see what direction you're thinking.
I would want to look at the of what is being said. So we could maybe, as we flip over to Luke, take a look at, what is, as the angels come and make announcements, and as it's kind of presented, what is the message that's being shared? What are people excited about?
Sure.
And I don't think that the primary thought is the way that we think about, oftentimes articulate. The primary thought is, oh crap, we're sinners. We're going to die and go to hell. We're screwed. What's happening? The primary thing is there's all these promises of God, all these covenants that are left unfulfilled. We are longing for the King and the kingdom. It's just nonsense.
Are you getting those?
Yeah, I'm getting kind of some crazy stuff here. I don't know if I can. Yeah, I'll do this. I think I can block user. We'll get rid of that. Okay. Took care of that. Is the primary, I believe, and again, do the Berean thing yourselves in your time here, and go back to the scriptures and say, what is it that's being said? I think the primary thrust is that the king is arriving, and the kingdom is arriving. Now, this is a story about how the king came to earth, and I think the story of the Gospels is the arrival of the king and the coming of the kingdom. Now, the cross is the necessary part that the king has to go through, King Jesus, and the necessary entry point to the kingdom is through the cross. And so in that way, yes, absolutely. But I think the king and the kingdom is the primary orientation of the Gospels, of the whole Bible in the New Testament, and of these stories, and that Jesus is dying as an important part of that is something that nobody got.
Yeah.
I don't think Mary knew that. I don't think Zechariah knew that. I don't think anybody. I don't think Simeon and Anna were thinking about, this guy's got to die.
Right.
Although once they reflected back and saw the suffering servant of Isaiah, etc., made all those connections. So again, I'm not at all saying that that's wrong that Jesus came to die. I'm just saying, don't fast forward too fast and put that in the essential place, but in its place, not as the only thing. Yeah.
Certainly, as you're talking, I'm thinking about, what does Mary say in her song? What does Simeon say when he holds the baby Jesus? And of course, Simeon has this little line at the end where he says to Mary, "A sword will pierce your heart too." So prophetically, he is looking ahead. But yeah, you're exactly right. The thrust of this thing is God has at long last done the thing he's promised to do. The one that we've been waiting for has come.
So let's flip over to Luke and take a look just a little bit at this, and then we'll talk about the nativity story that fascinates people so much here. So feel free, folks, if you're along, to jump in with questions or comments here along the way as well. But let me just I'm trying to think of what was so much to this. Let me do this into this conversation that we're having. Look at Luke chapter 1, verse 32. This is the angel Gabriel coming to Mary to kind of bring her word of course, what's going to happen. There's a lot going on here, more than I want to talk about. But I just want to look at the content, of kind of what's being said here, because Gabriel says to her about who her son's going to be. Verse 32, he will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end. So this is what, and this is the angel Gabriel. This is God's representative saying, here's the thing that I'm bringing to pass here. Here's one of the most important things that's happening, is that this promise that God gave to David, that he will have a descendant on the throne, and all of these messianic hopes and expectations are being fulfilled in Jesus, and his kingdom is coming. He is this promised Messiah, and his kingdom will never end. I mean, that's the cross absolutely fits into that, but it's not primarily what's being said here, I don't think.
Right. No, that certainly is a good point.
So yeah, there's a lot of interesting things here. Mary's song, often called the Magnificat, is just so fascinating as well too, and I think gives a little bit of a glimpse already into the kind of upside down kingdom, the upside down nature of what God is doing versus the ways of the world, right, in the way that things look around us and who's important and who's in charge and who's what. And Mary sees God as really upending this. And in a sense, we can see that from the very beginning in the story of Jesus's birth here, right? Yeah. So we'll spend a little bit of time, right, maybe maybe we'll conclude with this. And again, feel free if there's questions to jump them in here.
Yeah, certainly. I think Luke's account brings up some of those issues, going back to where we started. I know I've heard this somewhere. And then we go to the Bible and we read and we think, well, wherever I heard it, it wasn't the Bible, because that's not how the text reads. So Luke is doing some things that Matthew is not doing or is not focusing on. And probably, if we think about the first 7 verses of Luke 2, this is kind of the traditional children's Christmas pageant, right? That we get in church, Christmas Eve or whatever it is we do the pageant,
right?
And these
Magi too, but this is the kind of
right. This is where we get the favorite elements of Mary and Joseph traveling. Of course, Mary is always riding on a donkey. The donkey's not mentioned in Luke 2. Hate to say it. Maybe she's riding a donkey. Maybe
she could be, but it doesn't say that.
Very well could be. Yeah. I actually, you'll get a kick out of this, Dan, because I know you like the apocryphal books and kind of these extra writings. But I was doing some research, and there's an Epistle of James, an apocryphal Epistle of James.
That's one that tells the Christmas story.
Yeah,
with the details that we're used to, more of them.
Right. Dated to about 150. So later than any of the gospel narratives.
Not written by James.
No, James is long gone at this point. And that's the first mention of the donkey, that Mary was riding on a donkey, right? Yeah. So again, not necessarily wrong, not historically inaccurate, but if we're going with Luke's strict account, the donkey isn't the main character in this story. Surprise, surprise.
You can actually find, folks, if your interest really is piqued, you can dig into stuff and find a much discussion. And it's hard for me to remember where I read what, but there's various discussion about what a donkey costs, whether somebody at the socioeconomic level of Mary and Joseph could have afforded to have a donkey or not, and this kind of things like you can read about. And this is not fanciful. It's real discussion, but it's, it kind of gets far afield if you want to go there, there are real scholars who are talking about it. But again, the text itself just simply does not say these details one way or the other. Let's just read this. It's not long. In Luke, do you want to read it or you want me to read it? Luke chapter 2.
Let me do that. In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged, and who was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child. Now, I'll just pause as I'm reading and say, while they were there. It doesn't say in the last moment as they were approaching the city, oh no, it's time, quick, we got to find something.
My water just broke. Find the place, Joseph. What's wrong with you?
At some point.
You couldn't even say, you did this to me. Like, cry out to God. What?
Right. While they were there, perhaps they had even been in Bethlehem for some time. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth. I'll stop again. That is a loving, wonderful mother thing to do, is to wrap your child in bands of cloth. These aren't stray rags that they found in the corner of the room.
So, yeah, right. So my understanding, I did a little bit of reading on this too. My understanding is that this was very common practice, is what they did. And the kind of folklore of it was they thought it helped keep their arms and legs straight. Like if they didn't do it, they might grow crooked or something. So it was common to do. But one of the interesting things, Judd, that I came across I didn't realize before is that because when you get to it, the two signs to the shepherds are the cloths and the manger, which is out of the ordinary.
Right.
But the point of the swaddling cloths was not that it was so unique, but that it was a newborn baby.
Right.
You don't swaddle a 1-month-old that still looks like a teeny baby, but it's a brand new baby.
Yeah. Kind of deal. So we have, you'll look for a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes, very normal. Right. Lying in a manger, not quite so normal.
Yeah, but there wouldn't have been many, probably in a town the size of Bethlehem, many newborn babies, period.
Right.
So swaddling cloth gives you clue number one. The manger gives you the, checkmate. This is the one.
Right. Okay. So newborn child, firstborn child, wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn. Now, there's two kind of key words in these verses that we need to talk about. The one we've already been throwing around is manger, and then the other is inn. What is the place that there was no room for? Again, you'll notice the innkeeper, everyone's favorite role in the scene in the Christmas Passion. There's no innkeeper mentioned.
She's pregnant. Where's the ring?
So we'll take these each in turn. We'll start with manger. Manger, the word manger appears 4 times in Luke's gospel. 3 of them are right here in Luke chapter 2. He's laid in a manger, and then the shepherds are told to look for him in the manger, and then they go and find him in the manger. And then we have one other reference in Luke chapter 13 and verse 15, in which Jesus is talking, and he's talking to the Pharisees on the Sabbath. And he says to them, if you're on the Sabbath, don't you untie your animal from the manger and lead it out to get water. Those are the times that this word shows up in Luke's gospel. When we hear the word manger, again, going back to beautiful Christmas cards and paintings and our carols, what we picture is sort of a stable, a building. This is the 4 walls and a roof where all the animals are kept. And more likely, and we'll get into this more as we talk about inn, more likely the manger is a feeding trough. We're talking about a smaller item that Jesus can be physically placed into. Where would you find a feeding trough? I mean, that's where a lot of times the words aren't used with the precision that we would like them to be. Right. So a word can have, the fancy word is semantic range, right? There's a range of ways that you can use a word. And sometimes one became associated with the other. So if you had a manger, the place where you fed the animals, well, where do you feed the animals? Not just anywhere, but in the place where they stay. Yep.
oftentimes. So that, so you can use the word in that with that breadth of terms, but you probably don't just lay Jesus in a stable just anywhere on the ground.
Right.
There's some more specific, I think, idea here. And the manger as the feeding trough would make sense. It would be the right size-ish. It would be contained. That would be, assuming there wasn't a proper place. Joseph, the tecton carpenter, whatever, didn't make him a good place. But
right.
So,
right.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit less, controversial to an extent, although it kind of wraps into the next piece.
Right.
For the total picture, because the idea, I think the word stable is going to become kind of not necessarily wrong, but also taking us in a different direction than would have probably been the reality on the ground. And and that of course connects to the second as well, kind of word or idea here.
Yep. So if you're more interested in this, the first resource that Dan mentioned, the book by Bailey, the first chapter or two, he does a fantastic job with this. But what we need to have in mind, and again, this goes back to, are we picturing a 16th century European house, or are we picturing a first century Palestinian house, let alone a 21st century American house? But we need to think of...
Ready?
Oh, look at
this. Look at that. All right, finish your thing, then I'll bring it back up.
All right. So even if you want to pull that up while I'm talking,
I have two. Let me. I'm not sure which one of these you like better. This one is, I think, one that's more even in that book you were talking about.
Oh yeah. Okay, that's beautiful.
Like that, and then just for a second, I'll just say this is more of a kind of artistic. I'll talk about it, and then I'll add in some more.
Sure. All right. So if you look at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, where the door is in the bottom left-hand corner, let's call that the front door of the house, so to speak. Now, keep in mind what we're dealing with here is, with this layout, a one-story house. It's going to have a flat roof, and that's going to be important in just a minute. I'll explain why. But you'll notice that if you enter in what I'm calling the front door, that bottom left-hand corner of the screen, what you have first is an area for the animals. At night, all of the animals, the sheep, the horse, whatever animal you had, I don't know if people would have horses. Sheep, goats, those kinds of things, would be brought inside the house. This served several purposes. One, it would keep the animals warm and safe. The other element is it would keep the humans warm, right? You don't have a central heating system, but the animal's body heat is going to do a significant thing to heat up that space. Okay, so this would be a space for the animals inside the house,
and it would keep them safe from potential theft as well, since this is the biggest part of their assets, probably.
Right.
These animals. So. Yep.
You'll notice we have in that space a manger, right? Again, the feeding trough. Now, the next room in the house, the house would be slightly slanted. That would be helpful for cleaning. Think of the woman who loses her coin and sweeps out her whole house. It's easier if you can sweep downhill. But on the same story, perhaps you see a few stairs going up there, but this is not a staircase. It's just a few stairs. There you have the family room. The entire family is going to be living in the same room, which is really the only room of the house. Now, what some families would do is build a guest room either on the back of the house, and that's what we have represented in this picture, or on top of the house, and that's what we have represented in this second picture. That becomes why it's important that the roof is flat, because it's easy to build up. You just put an extra room on top. I need to pause here a minute to make sure I get it right. It wasn't Elijah. It was Elisha. Nope, reverse. It was Elijah who was provided for by the widow. No, it was the couple. Well, I can't remember now if it was Elijah or Elisha. One of them has One of them has a house built, has a room built on top of the house to be a guest room for the prophet when he comes to stay, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So likely what we're dealing with this room, with this word that we translate inn, there was no room in the inn. Probably what that word inn refers to is the guest room. This extra room either on the back of the house or built on top of the house. Everybody who's from the tribe of David, who's descended from Bethlehem, is descending on this tiny little hamlet to be part of this registry, this census. And by the time that Mary and Joseph show up, other relatives have already asked for and received hospitality. They are in the extra room. So Mary and Joseph show up. The family is going to say, I'm sorry, there's no room in the extra room. But while you and I would say, sorry, house is full, I don't know what to tell you, there's no more room, that's not going to fly in first century Palestine. The realm of hospitality is so strong. You do not turn someone away. You're certainly not going to turn away someone from your tribe, from your family. This may even be distant relatives that we're talking about. And so Mary and Joseph, likely, they're going to say, sorry, there's no room in the inn, the guest room, but we'll throw down a couple extra blankets and you can stay with us in the main room. Now, when the child is born, where are you going to put the child? Well, let's put him down in that lower area where the animals are. There's this feeding trough here. That will be a bed for the baby. Everybody's together in the same room, which also means we're going to debunk another Christmas movie picture. Joseph is not the only other person in the room with Mary delivering the baby, probably. Again, this is all conjecture. But it makes logical sense that the woman of the house and the neighbors and all the women would have gathered together and helped this poor little girl who needs help delivering her first child. Is it humble? Yes, absolutely. Is it a miraculous? Yes, absolutely. Is it Mary and Joseph all by their lonesome? Probably, maybe not, because that's not how
the interesting takeaway potentially is that we make a lot of this at times as a preaching point. Rejected. Will you reject him?
Sure.
kind of thing, where it's not necessarily the case, and probably not the case that Mary and Joseph were rejected by place after place or at all necessarily. Right. That becomes much more in the speculative realm. It's also possible, there's ways to read this. It's also possible that there wasn't literally room in the guest room, even if they were there, to do this birthing process with these other women, et cetera. It was just too small of a room, potentially. Right. I think this scenario you laid out is probably more likely. But the mangers were also oftentimes in between this family room and the animal room. So Jesus wasn't necessarily way into that animal room. He could have probably been in between the two rooms that they could have used to feed the animals without being right in there. We also don't know, Judd, if there was actually any animals in that room. Sure. Shepherds are out there at night. It's probably a warmer time of the year. When was this is another question we may not have time for today. I don't know. But yeah, this is a big one. And so our friend George Jensen seems frustrated of why translations like the one that you read continue to use the word "in" when it seems sort of misleading. Right. Which I think is a valid question, and it's a good. I feel the question in that every time in Scripture that we come across something that we feel like isn't translated well, it's frustrating because when you have to explain to people at times why words in Scripture don't mean what they seem to mean to you, it's kind of like, am I undercutting people's trust in this translation, in the translation? It's frustrating when you feel like, why don't you just change it so I don't have to do this explanation?
Right.
Even though it helps me earn my paycheck, but
Yeah. So this word, and that's important to talk about, because it's not just saying, oh yeah, the Bible says inn, but I'm going to call it a guest room, right? The word that's here, kataluma in Greek, is used in a couple different ways. When we look at the Septuagint, which is the Old Testament translated into Greek, this word is used a couple times. Moses in Exodus 4 stays in a kataluma. Saul and Samuel stay in one in 1 Samuel chapter 9. So it is a place where sort of, if you're traveling, this is where you go to stay, sort of the way that we would think of inn. It's also the word that is used of the upper room, where Jesus celebrates the Last Supper with his disciples. So again, thinking back to that more nuanced picture that Dan showed for us, where there's stories in the house, the upper room would be the room on top there, where that word loom is. That would be the upper room, right? That would be where you would go to have your meal. Hey, is there an extra room in the house that we can use? Yeah, you can use the guest room. You can use the inn, so to speak, right? As to why we keep translating it in when perhaps guest room or spare room might be more helpful, I have an interesting analogy. One of my professors in seminary was part of the ESV translation committee, and they were working in the book of Esther. And if you remember, in Esther, the bad guy Haman builds a contraption to kill Mordecai, right? And the way that we always think about this, translate this contraption that Haman builds, is a gallows. The problem is the Persians didn't hang people on, when we think gallows, we're picturing kind of a noose that you hang someone with.
They impaled them?
That's not what the Persians did. They impaled people on long spikes. So likely what Haman is building, almost certainly what Haman is building, is a spike to impale Mordecai. And so my professor was talking about, this is a weird analogy for Christmas, I recognize that, but
born to die, Judd.
But my professor talked about the fact that when they were translating this, they said, okay, option A is we can translate this spike or pole or that kind of thing, which is more accurate, but it's going to freak everybody out. They're going to say, wait a minute, my entire life I've been reading gallows. Why did you translate this spike in the ESV? Or they could say we could stick with what people are familiar with, even if maybe it's not the most historically accurate. They ended up sticking with gallows because they didn't want it to be so shocking. My hunch would be, I don't know this for sure, but my hunch would be that translation committees over the years have come to this word and said, well, maybe inn is not the best historical word for this, but it's the word everybody is expecting to see. How provocative do we want to be in our translation in using a different word? I don't know that that's the case, but it's a reminder to us that translations, as wonderful as they are, as helpful as they are, oftentimes come down to a judgment call. What's going to be most helpful here? What's going to help people? And people are going to see it differently.
And sometimes too, I mean, tradition plays more at times of a tradition of interpretation, translation rather, plays more of a role than maybe it should. So for example, Psalm 23 or the Lord's Prayer, there's a strong, even in more recent translations, there's a strong push to keep it sounding closer to the King James than maybe it would if you just had a vacuum and there was no history of translation,
right,
there at all. Interestingly, I went through, I think, all of the kind of more common translations, and a majority still stick within the two that don't that have guest room are the NIV and the CSB, Christian Standard Bible.
Okay.
Those two go with guest room.
Okay.
So I think guest room is the better translation. So I'm with George. I use the NIV, so I'm not as frustrated about it as he is. But the reality is that, as you kind of alluded to, Judd, this word in its semantic range, my fancy word again, its range of possible usage can include about everything under the sun.
Sure.
So to translate it in is not an incorrect option.
Right.
It's a valid option. The problem is, and I think to George's frustration, and he shared some commentary on this, is that Luke never uses it in the way that we would think of as an in. Right. So the time that it is used in Luke's gospel in a different sort of setting is in the parable of the Good Samaritan, where he is the injured man is put up in an inn. It's a different word that's used.
Right.
And our understanding, as best as we can, of kind of the ancient world is that Romans would sometimes build these inns upon major travel routes, of which Bethlehem was not one.
Right.
So the chances of Bethlehem having an inn that's the ancient equivalent of the Motel 6 is extremely unlikely.
Right. On the rare occasion that someone's visiting Bethlehem, they can stay with family.
Right.
A hotel's not going to stay in business.
And Judd, it amazes me that the fact that these small houses would prioritize. We're talking about sometimes people in their own family didn't have their own room. Like parents didn't have a different room from their kids.
No, everyone's in the same room.
And yet had a guest room.
Yeah.
For us, that's like, you're like rich, you're like whatever. If you can have a nice guest room, like that's a bonus.
Right.
Not like an essential. And for them, that was the case. So I do not think if I was on a translation committee, which I never will be because I'm not a Greek scholar, I would not vote for in. I would vote for guest room. I think that's the better translation. I think in is somewhat misleading, but it's not an incorrect translation of a possibility. Right. I just don't think it's the best translation. Yeah. As you mentioned, the other place that it's used is in the upper room that the Last Supper takes place in. So that's that, but it is what it is.
Right. Right.
So again, not an incorrect translation. I don't think the best translation to go within, but it'll be interesting to see, Judd, as translations continue to update, if any other ones do change this.
Right.
I'm not sure. So.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to jump into in this story? I think we hit some of the high points here.
Yeah. I think we'll wrap it up at this point. Certainly, if there are either things that we left unsaid that you would like to see addressed, or if maybe we said something but went over it too quickly and you want, wait a minute, what about that? Dan and I are always happy either to jump back on the video and talk about it more, or just respond in the comments.
Yeah. If you want to push back on something, if you feel like there is more evidence for one thing that we kind of said, there's not a lot of evidence for, feel free to share that. You can share if you have a link or something to jump in there with that. Maybe next year or in a future video, we'll talk more about why Luke and Matthew have such different events. Why don't they both include all this story and they have something separate? We've seen some interesting things about that, so maybe that'll come up in the future. I am working on a blog post of sorts to draw together some different good articles and posts and links to things that you might find interesting to dig in deeper on these. So look for that hopefully from me sometime this week. I'll post a link on our page here. Thank you for those who joined us and those who will watch this later. We appreciate you. Have a great Christmas.
Merry Christmas, everybody.
We'll see you later. All right. Bye.